Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Think BRICS YouTube channel. Today, I am once again thrilled to have Dr. Warwick Powell here again to join us. Dr. Powell, who is a very popular commentator, not just with us, but with our entire audience, is an adjunct professor at Queensland University who studies the intersection of China's economy with things such as digital technologies, supply chains, and financial flows, as well as the global political economy and global governance. He has written the book China, Trust, and Digital Supply Chains Dynamics of a Zero Trust, which is available on Amazon for you guys to check out. I personally recommend it, and it's discussing the adoption and blockchain development in China itself. So, thank you again, Dr. Powell, for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Ben.
Awesome. Yeah. And for today's conversation, I really want to talk about one of your most recent articles calling Addressing Involution, Reflecting on China's Economic Structure and Dynamics. And for those who are interested, it's a very compelling read, and I recommend it to everyone. It's on his Substack. And for those who are curious about China's economic dynamics, can we first establish what the idea of involution is and the relevance to Chinese economic policy?
Yeah, involution was actually an idea that emerged in China itself, where people were looking at a way of trying to capture a sense of a few different experiences, I guess, would come together in this idea of involution. The idea that could put in a lot of work but still get nowhere. The idea of intensive competition meant that profitability was low, and so it tries to capture this sense that um, uh, as much as China is developing, it doesn't matter how much effort one puts in, the pressures are still there that make personal and economic life very, very difficult. And and so it has recently come onto the national agenda as far as an issue of interest and concern is concerned, and that is that um, there are worries that the extent of competition it has become so cutthroat that it is making the life of enterprises very, very difficult in terms of their cost recovery, and also putting an incredible amount of pressure on people themselves as they seek to keep their enterprises going in this context of intense competition. So that's roughly the issue of involution.
Yeah, and one of the sort of interesting things are with balancing kind of that lack of cost reduction is some people in Western societies would argue, well, you're going to have to mark up the cost to deal with the intense competition or something to help compete with these statewide firms. But kind of an interesting caveat to this is the Chinese citizens have been prone to save a lot more in contrast with someone that is in America like myself, or with other UK and other Western societies. And this has led economists to say that the Chinese economy is not living up to its potential. Right? It's over investing. It's not letting citizens consume more than they can. Consume as much as they can. Do you think that's true, or do you think that's, I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, it's a very mainstream trope that for one reason or another, Chinese consumers or consuming households save too much and don't spend enough. And there's a whole range of implications that arguably are spun out of that core observation, namely that that industry, Chinese industry, simply doesn't have enough domestic demand to service and therefore must expand overseas, which then leads to arguments about China's trade surplus in manufactures and its implications on global balance. I tend to have a different view of all of this, namely uh, that whatever the savings rate is in China, it's actually a residual. So savings is what happens afterwards. It's not actually a constraint or an enabler of anything. Savings is what households or enterprises, for that matter, have after they've spent their income. And so it's actually the rate of investment and the rate of demand which dictates the rate of savings, not the other way around. Savings, in that sense, it doesn't tell you whether a place is getting wealthier or not, or whether, in fact, it is as wealthy as it potentially could be. Uh, and I think the evidence for that is quite clear, and that is that over the course of, say, the last 20 years, Chinese real incomes for households have increased substantially, hundreds of percent actually, over that period of time, and households are immeasurably better off today than they were 20 years ago. The confusion that often arises, firstly, is that the proportion of the what a household does with its income, whether it spends it or saves it, that question of proportionality really misunderstands that the real driver of economic transformation and development is the absolute quantity to start with. Because there is an interesting counterfactual in China's own experience, and that is 60 years ago, uh, China's consumption rate was well into the 60 odd percent mark. In other words, savings was considerably lower. And yet, there is no doubt that at the time, China and Chinese households were far less well off than they are today. So, to somehow think or to extrapolate from a residual measure, which is the rate of savings, as if that somehow tells us something about the potential of material well-being, really misunderstands the dynamics at work. The other question that is often not asked in this context is, how is it that Chinese households are able to satisfy their material requirements whilst at the same time being able to save so much money relative
Yeah.
to the situation in, say, the United States, where household saving rates are well below 4 or 5% now, having spiked during the COVID period. And in fact, many American households have negligible savings at all and are barely able to get by on a week to week basis. Over 60% of American households report that they live paycheck to paycheck. Um, Similar proportions of American households have no more than 400 US dollars in the bank as part of their backup plan. So we do have contrasting social settlement systems, if you will, but the idea of this proportional mix between consumption versus savings, as if that somehow tells you something in and of itself about the dynamics of a system, really takes us down down. I think an economic and social dead end.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny too because it seems like when, 5 or 10 years ago, they would talk about GDP as sort of the absolute economic macroeconomic standard. GDP grows 3%, 5%, everyone would be in high praise. But as we've seen more and more, we really don't. GDP is really not the statistic that we should be relying on to report the economic activity of each nation. So, to your point about um, both the Chinese citizens able to continue their rate of savings, but also, as we've quite frankly seen, they've been able to bear the fruit of the investments of all of the infrastructure plans that the government and everyone have laid out. Can you talk to me about what the Chinese growth model is and how
Yeah,
people are benefiting? Yeah.
yeah. So when we talk about household expenditure and savings, we need to remember that households spend what they earn and save as a result what they don't spend. In other words, they have to earn something first. So the real question from an economic development point of view and from a system dynamics point of view is to understand how that happens. And that happens as a result of exogenous demand drivers. In other words, demand drivers that are not dependent on the income of the previous cycle. And the demand drivers are principally investment that is activated through the injection of new system liquidity, either by way of government spending or by way of commercial bank created credit or by way of export incomes, because those incomes come from outside of your own system. So these are your two principal areas that drive the process forward. Now, China is fundamentally not a trade-dependent economy, contrary to what many impressions are. And what we confuse, of course, is the volume of exports and imports that China participates in, with the idea without realizing that in the scheme of things, it's a relatively small proportion of the economy at large. So, from a manufacturer's point of view, for example, Chinese manufacturing export to output ratio is about 20% these days. So, Chinese firms in manufacturing export 1 in 5 units of output. But you've got to weigh that from a system point of view against what China itself imports. And in the scheme of GDP as a measure, net trade delivers less than 3% of China's overall economic growth. So trade as a feature of China's economic development growth model is actually relatively modest, particularly in terms of its contributions to the GDP. So the drivers of China's economic development, particularly in the last 20 years, have increasingly been the domestic economy, the domestic circuit, so to speak,
Hmm.
driven by, firstly, the ongoing investment in public infrastructure, which
Yep.
then creates the environment that catalyzes consumer expenditure, and which further catalyzes the demand for bank credit from entrepreneurs who are then creating or expanding on their existing businesses. So these are the dynamics at work. Much of the China's economic development is catalyzed by public investment, which then spurs on uh, private demand for credit. The critical measure of China's model then is to understand how private demand for credit uh, contributes to not only aggregate levels of activity, but
Hmm.
also what those activities enable. So, if you think about the economic model during the course of the 2010s, much or a substantial proportion of that era was dominated by the expansion of real estate.
Hmm.
And the rate of credit growth in the real estate sector in China had reached somewhere in the order of 18% by 2018, 2019. In other words, credit into real estate sector was absolutely booming. Now, there were already concerns around 2017, 2018 that the real estate sector was over leveraged. Its real economy foundations were not in a position really to deliver on the credit claims that were going to be made against it, and that there was also a need to fundamentally change the structure of Chinese value adding to reduce the role of real estate as a driver of economic activity to one that focused a lot more on fast tracking and landing the consequences of many years of research and development in high
Hmm.
technology, renewable energy, automation, and digital infrastructure. So we saw in 2017, 2018, the beginnings of the moves to deleverage the Chinese property sector and to substitute the credit that was flowing into that sector with credit that would be going into these sort of high tech manufacturing areas. And what we see by say 2020 with the real rollout of China's EV industry and other high tech manufacturing sectors, including the application of robotics, 5G technologies, etc., right across its industrial base, is the transformation of China's economy from one where real estate played a very significant role, somewhere in the region of 30% of GDP, to one where it's almost halved today, but where it has in many regards been replaced by high tech manufacturing. The last thing I'll say in this regard is that this transition, this deleveraging that has taken place, has actually, interestingly, uh, not resulted in radical disruptions of the labour market and as a result of that social life. Because it's the labour market that connects the economy, broadly speaking, with the social life, because that's where people earn their incomes. And whilst this big change was taking place, this big rotation of the social capital away from property or real estate into these other areas, China's overall unemployment rate hovered around 5.2%, whilst at the same time real wages were continuing to grow. So all of
Right.
that tells us that its economic system at large, in a sort of macro sense, was actually functioning in relatively resilient ways, whereby it could adapt to these sorts of transformations. And of course, that's not to say that there aren't challenges when you're making such radical changes or large scale changes. There will be pockets of adverse impacts, whether it's geographic or demographic. But in the broad scheme of things, this rotation of the social capital, this deleveraging in property, and the transformation of high tech manufacturing has, I think, delivered results that have certainly pleased the Chinese authorities and pleased people in China, but it certainly surprised, I think, many observers in the West.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, like you said, as the Chinese economy has been able to successfully really pivot to something that is now more high capital intensive industries, where they obviously, as you said, where the investment or the credit really shifted from the real estate and that sort of complementary construction sector towards things like advanced technologies, electric vehicles, and the like. We've really seen that change and that importance now on the highly capital intensive industries. To your point, though, you do mention that while it is a successful transition for the Chinese economy to get there, not everybody is going to be a winner in this case. And for one thing that I am thinking about, it is those who do not have the credentials really to be involved in the high capital intensive industries where that investment is now going. So, how do you think China will be able to deal with sort of the offsetting effects that we're seeing really with the unskilled workers? I guess is what I'll call it here.
Yeah, look, this of course is a pivotal question when there are major technology changes taking place across an economic system. It's certainly not the first time in modern human history where technological change leads to the disruptions of certain skill sets and and growing demand for others. China itself is going to have to address this. The principal way that it's addressing this is through a combination of sustained investment in higher education and also vocational education, number one, to cultivate a population that has the skill sets necessary to take advantage of and contribute meaningfully to these sorts of new areas. The vocational education is being driven not just to younger people, but it's to support skills development and skills transfers amongst older people. The second thing is to promote, I guess, what we would broadly describe as the human-intensive services sector, where the kinds of technical skills that one might require to work in automated environments where you're supporting technologies aren't so important, and where the non-routine capabilities of human beings, the ability to figure out when we don't have to follow the rules, if you will, and to
Right.
adapt to specific circumstances. That's a very human thing, and that's the sort of services sector that I think that there is some hope that will help people who may not be necessarily so strong um, on the cognitive side of job roles, but are more physical in nature. They will be able to make those transitions. I guess the picture that I'm painting here is one that sees an economic and social system transitioning in ways where um, routine roster or routine cognitive or routine manual roles will increasingly be undertaken by either computers or by robots, and
Hmm.
where non-routine cognitive and non-routine manual roles is where human beings can continue to flourish, and so these transitions will need to be made. Now, the last piece of this jigsaw puzzle, of course, in the end, is for those who fall through the cracks, is to have a reasonable social safety net, either through former workplace insurance or other forms of social insurance, to ensure that China does not experience the emergence of a cohort of people who simply did not cope with economic structural change and who have been left behind. Now, the extent to which success in managing these transitions will be known will take some time. I guess one of the upsides for a Chinese society in transition is that China society as a whole has been going through rapid change now for many decades, and so the ability of people to cope with change is very, very high, even if we can see from time to time some change fatigue being in place. So people can cope with change, and the second thing that enables people to cope well with change is that the provision of public goods and services is constantly improving. And I mean by that, in particular, things like healthcare services, which would otherwise be a potential burden on people who don't have work, as well as housing. So there's plenty of housing for Chinese people. And in fact, the rate of home ownership, is very, very high in China. It's over 80%. So most people have
Wow.
a house, that they own, and I think one of the mechanisms that will see China improve its adaptability is there is a move to harmonise what are in effect multiple provincial and city markets around China. What
Hmm.
people often don't understand is that China is in some regards is the amalgam of 30 odd provinces, and each provincial economy has its own dynamics in a regulatory sense as well. So there are now moves from the central government to progressively harmonise a whole range of regulations concerning markets in China. Now that will enable um, businesses to do things easier across provinces in theoretical terms, anyway. But the other thing that is likely to unfold as time goes by is progressive relaxation around the movement of people. So whilst you can move from A to B freely in China and use the high speed rail networks and other things to get from A to B, the accessibility of certain social services, whether it's education or healthcare, is typically attached to where you are registered, and where you're registered is connected in large part to where you were born. And to get a registration in a place that you've moved to is not always easy. So relaxations around the household registration system will, I suspect, also contribute to the ability by which people who are impacted by these sorts of changes can ultimately make the adjustments. The other thing that's probably worth mentioning, and this is again part of the visualization of the dynamics of China, is not only are we experiencing sectoral transformation, that move from real estate to things like high tech manufacturing, but that's also accompanying a geographical transformation as well. So, 40 years ago, the economic development journey of China really saw the East Coast cities boom first before
Yep.
efforts were made to bring development inland into the West. And we're starting to see high tech manufacturing activities, for example, push further and further out of the big cities into regional townships and cities again. And and that is creating employment opportunities for people on the so-called hinterland economy, but it's also creating pathways for younger people who will have an education, but for whom housing in one of the big five cities is incredibly expensive, to actually find their way back to a second or third tier city where they can enjoy good jobs, good pay, and actually in real disposable income terms actually improve living standards. So these are the dynamics at play. Now, can you find individual stories which would say this isn't working very well? I have no doubt that you could. There will always be individual experiences that don't fit the rule. But I think by and large, the patterns of transformation and the institutions and policy responses to emergent problems are delivering reasonably positive results, which gives, I think, the government and people in China confidence and encouragement that this pathway is heading in the right direction.
Yeah, the fact that China has been you could really kind of outline a lot of the details of not just within your article, but within the party policy framework that they've been simultaneously been able to stimulate the labor demand, pivot to a capital intensive infrastructure led economy, but also have diversified sources of energy to supply that economy that fuels its labor to keep the economic train moving, I guess is what, high speed train moving, if I'm going to make a pun here. And it's really interesting that they've been able to basically do this simultaneously. Meanwhile, there are countries, in the in the West right now that are struggling really in terms of a fiscal perspective, trying to get out of the emergent debt that they're in. But if we're going to really take the lessons, and I know that obviously one economy doesn't translate apples to apples to another, but how could other like BRICS nations learn from China's investment growth model on their own economies to get the results that they're really sorting out to get?
Yeah, look, I think that there's, in large part, three core dimensions to this. One is to lay down the infrastructure of flow, of what I generally call it, which is the infrastructure necessary to enable goods and services and people to move.
Yep.
Without that, your economic system is always going to be quite constrained. And when I say move, I mean, of course, move domestically, but also enable effective trade internationally. So creating the infrastructure of flow and connectivity is vital. Part of that also is to create the infrastructure that enables information to flow as well. And in this day and age, of course, that is principally digitalization. Whether it's computers as well as communication networks, it's vital that from a development point of view, that critical infrastructure is put into place so that people and businesses, enterprises in different parts of a country or different parts of the world can connect in a low cost way with others. It's impossible to buy goods if you don't know they exist, just as it's impossible for bankers and insurers to provide the services that supply chains and enterprises need if there's no data concerning what's going on with those products. So information infrastructure is your second layer. That's absolutely pivotal. Now, to drive all of this, you also need to have highly efficient energy systems. So this, in some ways, is the most significant piece of this transformational journey because the ability for an economy to have access to uh, energy systems that deliver a very high energy return on energy invested outcome is actually the basis upon which you can do all the other things. Because a high EROEI setup creates a bunch of surplus energy in an abstract sense that can then be mobilized for other purposes. And the other purposes that wraps up this story, so to speak, is the transformation of human capability, which is to deliver skills and education right across the community to be able to take advantage of these new energy systems and the possibilities that that creates, the new information systems and the possibilities that that creates, and of course, the infrastructure of flow and the possibilities that that creates. So they're your principal lessons. Find pathways to achieving those things and at the same time achieving those things in ways that support and deliver on, I guess, what we'd call economic sovereignty these days. So, in information systems, ensure that your information systems, including your artificial intelligence capabilities, are not susceptible to external interference or external censorship. That's absolutely vital. So, controlling your own information domain, controlling your own information hardware systems, and also controlling your own software and databases and those sorts of things. Absolutely vital. Take advantage of open source technologies where you can. In terms of energy infrastructure, this really means getting away, if your country doesn't have your own crude oil and refining capabilities, getting away from systems that are dependent on oil, for example. Or if your country doesn't have a long history or doesn't have a lot of coal reserves or gas reserves, then getting away from energy systems where you're needing to use those sorts of energy sources makes a lot of sense. And we're starting to see, I think, the development of energy systems and technologies that enable rapid deployment in relatively distributed environments. So the traditional models have always been very high scale hubs and spokes kind of models. And the new technologies that we're starting to see come onto the market for energy generation and energy storage enables these sorts of sovereign energy systems to be implemented at relatively modest capital costs, but which also means that energy users and energy generators are actually quite close to each other and are less vulnerable to threats and shocks that might affect large grids. So they're the sorts of things that I think developing countries can take as lessons out of the Chinese development experience.
It's very interesting to think about relating sort of the energy producers with the energy users to see, like you said, like if they're going to be very closely related, if there is some kind of exogenous shock or something out of their control that happens, the energy producers will obviously hear from the energy consumers, right? Um, and even if we're looking kind of sort of outside of this sort of a kind of BRICS domain, as it were, there are countries that are either interested in joining BRICS or even countries that are on the outside in general that are trying to take lessons here from China's both investment demand model, but also how its economy has been able to transform and utilize everything from labor, capital, and energy, like you've described, to put it as the position as it were. Do you think that the sort of sectoral transformations, this transformation that the Chinese economy has had, let's say an economy in like the United States or Australia hypothetically wanted to adopt certain things like energy diversification, or like you said, policies that make that would allow for higher education, easier access to education, things of that nature for the labor force to make it easier. Do you see these countries adopting these models, or do you kind of think it's just us, or do you think it's just not even worth for them even thinking about right now?
Look, I think developing countries can adopt and adapt these models. Obviously, the circumstances of each national economy differs from each other in terms of population skill levels, population distributions, population densities, the existing availability of infrastructure, geography, topology, and all those sorts of things. That all impacts the sensible decisions that need to be made about what kind of infrastructure solutions will work best.
Mm-hmm.
But the general approach that we see from China, interestingly, is a hybrid approach that has, at a certain level, a very strong sense of national purpose. So that's the national plan, the 5-year plans, and those sorts of things. There's a very clear articulation of national purpose, but the delivery against that national purpose, against the backdrop of a very, very large and geographically diverse country, is that translating national purpose into implementable and scalable solutions actually gets pushed out to the edges quite a lot. And so China operates with a governance model that is, in many regards, one that has the principle of subsidiarity underpinning it, which is for decision making to be pushed to the level closest to the impact, the lowest level you can possibly go for that decision to be made. And and so that creates an institutional framework that allows places to respond to their actual circumstance. So I think that there is no reason why China's experiences, firstly, can't be learned from, but secondly, why a lot of the, if you want to call it a model, can't be adopted and adapted. See, China's economic development can be understood really through the lenses of a number of theoretical frameworks, but all of which have a common idea, and that is that it is investment that is the catalyst of transformational capability, and also it is the foundations of income. So, investment is actually what you need to kickstart these processes. Now, what countries need to be mindful of as they embark on these journeys is that the activation of resources through the injection of liquidity, what we would normally call the injection of capital, has to be done in a way that focuses on the transformation that's going to take place. There's no point borrowing foreign currencies, for example, if that borrowing doesn't lead to the fundamental transformation of your economy's capability to undertake higher levels or higher order material transformations, or to access, importantly, higher energy return on energy investment possibilities. There's no point going down a pathway where you're essentially where you're leaving yourself exposed to settling debts in currencies that you have to earn, that you don't create yourself, when your economic system hasn't actually been transformed. So it's a transformation that we've got to focus upon. The rest of it is just a process of creating the liquidity necessary for it. An interesting thing, experience really in development finance, say over the last 10 to 15 years, is the recognition that the mainstream institutions that were established after the Second World War have simply not delivered for the developing world. And I mean
Yep.
by that the IMF and the World Bank. And new institutions have been necessary. Some of those have been things like the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, but we also now have the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, and in the last 2 weeks or so, we've seen announcements coming out of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that an SCO development bank is also going to be established. Now, all of this tells us something, and that is that the developed world um, has, despite many decades of, or perhaps because of many decades of experience with these post-war institutions, have come to a view that, as things stand today, as much as these institutions need dramatic reform for them to work and to work properly, right now they're not working, and that the developing world, the global south, simply need to do its own thing. And that's what it's starting to do.
Yeah, I think that, like you have already pointed out, that the emerging economies are going to learn everything they can and want to learn from China's model. And obviously, like you said, adapt it to their own system, right? It's not going to be an apples to apples comparison. And with BRICS kind of elevating the BRICS has basically been a platform for increased cohesion and cooperation, both from an economic, political, and cultural standpoint, which I think really matters. And like you said, where there are ministers from another country that want to get insight into China's growth model, they need to really get involved with the not just with the government itself, but the people who help run the economy of itself to understand their perspective really and how they are taking things and how these ministers can apply it to their own system. And just as one more like super quick question, because I've been kind of alluding to all of the fiscal and monetary troubles that the that Western countries have had right now. I mean, we can talk about the United States, $37 trillion of debt. We could talk about the UK growing financial troubles, and France literally ousting, having a government collapse because of their financial troubles. Um, so I guess what I'm curious about is, from your perspective, can you see any country that is within that apparatus, like Australia, for example, uh, trying to get involved in BRICS because Australia is close to China and Southeast Asia, where BRICS is incredibly popular. Do you really see that as a potential possibility?
In short, not in the short term. There's a whole bunch of institutional and cultural and political legacies from centuries of colonialization that I think make it very, very difficult for countries to do that. Countries from the Western colonial position, the challenges that they face really goes to, and these are lessons that I think China has been trying to learn, goes to the rapid financialization of their economic systems to a point where the emergence of finance as a sector has become totally detached from the capabilities of the real economy to to deliver upon the claims that are being made. So credit and money are, in many regards, claims on future potential value.
Mm-hmm.
And if and the creation of credit into a system injects liquidity, and that liquidity then enables activities to be undertaken because people are able to use that liquidity, what I would call an exchange value, to exchange it sometime in the future for things that are of use value to them. The challenge comes in an economic system when the potential claims that can be made against the future are so great that the future simply buckles under the strains of trying to meet those claims. Uh, we see the results of that really as sort of the explosion over the course of the last 25, 30 years in the West of asset values without there being any real wages growth for over 50% of people, and where real economic value adding, and I don't just mean in physical things, but also in serious services sectors as well. You know, services sectors are very physical in nature. They use physical manufactured objects as much as they involve human beings doing things for others. Um, None of that has fundamentally grown in the ways in which the financialized sector, the sector of the claims on the future, has grown. And that's the situation we've got. Now, this issue of a national debt, I think we need to understand it in a very particular way. Many people are worried that it goes to questions of national solvency. I don't think the problem's a question of solvency. You know, if you owe money in the currency that you create yourself, then solvency is actually not your real problem. Your real problem is the ways in which the money creation process flows through into your economic system and what that liquidity ends up doing. And as I described, if the systems that you've got in place, the institutions that are in place, sees that additional liquidity basically pumped into financialized circuits and leads to further concentration of wealth, then that's going to undermine your capacity to do other things in an economic system and deliver for the majority of people, which ultimately leads to social costs. So that's the problem that we've got in many Western countries. The UK isn't going to run out of pounds because it can create the pound. The French situation is different, and it speaks, I think, to a very interesting problem that members of the Eurozone have. That is that countries gave up their ability to issue their own currencies when they came into the European Union. And now we have the European Central Bank, in essence, a million miles away from the requirements of each individual economy to dictate terms to national governments, and that's an important lesson to be learned actually for many other developing countries. Should they think about things like cohesive economic zones, you know, integrated markets, etc., etc. The European experience would strongly suggest that the last thing that any of them should think about is to have a common currency, particularly in ways that the European or the euro has been set up. Um, so I think that there are some interesting contrasts. The last thing that I'll say on this front is that the Chinese economic model, and I think that this is one of the features that makes it incredibly distinctive, is that the principal commercial banks are also publicly owned. And
Yeah.
the public ownership of commercial banks does enable a substantial policy role in shaping the national priorities of credit provisioning. And it can work much closer and in better coordination with the economic and industry development initiatives and ambitions of the government at large. And that's a very significant difference because privately owned banks with imperatives around delivering return on capital for shareholders are driven by a very different set of calculus, and their notions of what they will lend money to, you know, the credit worthiness of borrowers is very different from how publicly owned banks will view credit worthiness. People often fret, you know, Western commentators will fret about, you know, questions of Chinese bank profitability, but you know, it's really a non-issue in many regards, other than if the inability to have profit is a result of malfeasance or chronic incompetence. But the objective isn't profit per se. Profit is a residual that is suggestive of the fact that you're running an okay outfit. But the objectives of these institutions is actually to play a hand in glove role on economic development. So again, they're important lessons for developing countries to take on board.
Yeah, you make a lot of really good points. Honestly, throughout this entire discussion, I think you've really kind of really sold home the fact that it's not just what you invest, it's how you invest it, right? And even though that these banks are quasi public owned, where there's a mixture of private and public funding, that actually gives it such a better incentive for it to invest the money in a way that people like you and I would benefit in the future, right? Like when we're talking about that investment in the public infrastructure, when someone wants to go out of their house for a walk, if they're feeling down, hypothetically, they could enjoy the park that the government has helped finance and bring from the ground up nearby, or other attractions that they have that they get that residual to, really, the public investment. Everyone benefits, right? Where if there's a
Yeah.
paywall behind something, we won't see that as much, especially
Well,
with those who don't have the money to access it.
I mean, you mentioned the going for a walk piece, right? And in some ways, you sort of think that that's incredibly trite. But it's actually really important because over the course of the last 40 years, a very significant feature of China's economic development experience is urbanization. Okay, so more and more people are living in denser environments, and there are significant benefits to individuals if they walk more, and there's also significant sort of civic benefits for urban environments to be incredibly human and approachable and green, right? So China's cities are incredibly green. So public spaces have actually been a really important part of creating livable urban environments. So this isn't just a case of economic development for its own sake. We've now had a focus on creating those urban public goods that make urban living actually not just tolerable, but desirable. And transformations around features such as hills, the creation of large scale public parks, the cleaning up of waterways, transforming waterways into fantastic locations for public recreation. That's all taken place only in the last 15 years. In the old days, and this has been the case in Western cities as well, waterways have largely been the gutter for cities, where pollution from factories and also urban residential waste have basically poured themselves into the waterways of our cities, and they had become undesirable places. They smelled, they were dirty. In many regards, they were disease carriers, and that's all been transforming. And so it makes the quality of life, broadly speaking, much more tolerable. But if you think about it also from a whole of system point of view, a healthier, happier population, because you've got a decent environment to live in, is
Yeah.
less likely to be a cost burden on your society as a result of the kinds of health issues, whether they're mental health issues or physiological health issues that come with poor environments.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. It just goes to show when you invest in your people first, you see the fruits of your labor, right? And you see, when you
Yeah,
consider the lives of your people day to day, when you're creating these public spaces for not just their own, not just for specific scenarios, but for their own mental health, driving them to basically fulfill the potential that the government believes that they can achieve. That investment
yeah,
there is what's really driving them at the end of the day. So that is something that I think other economies should really be considering when you're putting all this money and investment into technology. Who at the end of the day is going to be managing and running that technology for you? Your labor, right?
yeah, absolutely.
So that's
Yeah,
so that's
absolutely.
yeah. So at the end of the day, I think that China's model is really hammering home that importance, but it's also been able to pivot itself into something where it's high technology, rising wages for the labor force, and diversified source of energy, so it puts itself in great place and in great shape for years and decades onwards. But for in the meantime, I do unfortunately have to conclude this interview. I sincerely appreciated you, Dr. or Professor Warwick Powell, for joining us today. For those who want to understand a bit more about what we talked about, please go to his Substack and not just read the Addressing Involution article like he has. Read through everything. You won't regret it. Trust me. Everything he has is so diverse and such interesting concepts. It really expands your mind on the importance of reading into economic policy, and you see the fallouts of it now. But until we meet again, thank you again, Professor Warwick Powell, for joining us today, and I hope we can get your insights back again here soon.
It's been a pleasure.